The chamber is silent, save for the crackle of candle wax dripping onto stone. The air smells of roses crushed too early, their sweetness already fading into something sour. You are draped in white silk that feels less like a gown and more like a shroud, each stitch tight against your breath. Outside, the bells toll for a celebration, but inside your chest there is only dread. Tonight, you are not a queen, not even a woman. You are an offering. The walls are heavy with whispers of brides who entered these rooms and never returned the same. The bed, dressed in velvet and gold, waits like a throne turned into a coffin. And as the door creaks open, you realize that no crown can protect you from the terror of a wedding night in a world where obedience is survival and silence is the only language you are allowed to speak. They told you from the very beginning that you were different, chosen, set apart by the will of God and the needs of men. Your life was never truly your own. In the quiet corridors of the palace, while other children played in fields and chased sunlight, you were taught to walk with perfect posture, to lower your gaze just enough to appear humble, yet never weak, to speak softly so that your words carried grace, but never defiance. Even the toys in your nursery were not toys at all, but symbols, miniature crowns carved in wood, tiny golden chalices, silken dolls dressed in gowns too fine to be touched by dirty hands. The sweet smell of honeyed bread in the mornings mingled with the thick smoke of candles burning endlessly in chapel corners, their flames whispering promises of holiness and sacrifice. You grew up surrounded by the language of destiny, each prayer, each lesson reminding you that your body was not yours. It was an offering, a vessel of peace, a treaty written in flesh. Your governesses filled your ears with stories of queens who tamed warring kingdoms by offering their hand, of women who crossed borders draped in silk and emerged as saints or mothers of dynasties. You believed those stories not because you were naive, but because they were the only truths allowed to you. When they spoke of love, it was painted in colors of duty. When they spoke of honor, it was bound tightly with obedience. You imagined your wedding day as something radiant, cathedrals filled with music, sunlight spilling through stained glass in jeweled colors, a hand reaching for yours with tenderness. But beneath those dreams, there were moments that unsettled you. The cold stare of a priest reminding you that your virtue was not your gift to give. The sharp tone of your father reminding you that your future had already been sold. Even as a child, you felt the faintest breath of dread, like a shadow at the edge of a candle's flame, knowing that one day all the silk, the pearls, the prayers would lead you to a night that was celebrated by all but feared by you alone. The day of preparation does not feel like yours. It feels like a ritual carved from centuries of repetition, a script played out by countless brides before you. From the moment the sun rose, your chamber filled with women, maids, attendants, matrons, each one tasked with shaping you into a figure that no longer belonged to flesh but to symbol. Their hands were unrelenting, tugging at fabric, cinching laces until your ribs ached, pressing against your skin with cold precision. The silk gown shimmered like moonlight, but as it slid across your body, it felt less like clothing and more like binding, every thread pulling you further away from yourself. The room smelled of lavender water and burning incense, heavy and cloying, as though the air itself was conspiring to suffocate doubt. They told you it was purification. To you, it felt like erasure. Your hair, once a child's comfort, was now a crown in itself, braided, twisted, pulled so tight your scalp burned, each strand locked into place until it gleamed like polished rope, a halo of obedience. Your cheeks were tinted with powders of crushed petals and chalky pastes, soft to the touch but heavy with implication. These were not paints to celebrate your beauty, but to prove it, proof of purity, proof of chastity, proof that your body was untouched and therefore valuable. As each layer was added, you felt less alive, more like a relic being prepared for display. Beyond the chamber walls, bells rang in great iron echoes. pealing across cobblestones where peasants gathered to cheer. Their voices rose in joy, but not for you. Their cheers were for the promise of heirs, for the hope of peace secured by your womb, for a dynasty stitched together by your silent compliance. Through the lattice window, you could almost smell the street. Sweat, bread, the musk of horses. But here inside, the air was too perfumed, too clean, too foreign. For a moment you wondered if anyone, even one voice in the crowd, thought of you as a person and not a vessel. The crown had not yet touched your head, yet already it pressed upon your shoulders. Invisible, immovable, inescapable. Evening comes, and with it the weight of inevitability. The procession is over, the vows spoken, the feast consumed by lords who laugh too loudly, their goblets spilling red wine like blood across white linen. They call it celebration, but to you it feels like sentencing. When the torches burn low and the music fades into echoes, you are led away, not as a queen, not even as a bride, but as a prize to be claimed. The corridors are cold, their stones sweating with damp, and each step of your slippers whispers across the silence like a heartbeat too loud in your ears. Behind you, the matrons murmur prayers, their words cloaked in pity, their faces too practiced to show horror. They have guided many girls down this same passage, and they know what waits at its end. The chamber door creaks open, groaning like wood reluctant to betray another soul. Inside, the air is thick with velvet and wax, candles standing like sentinels around the bed. Their flames flicker against crimson drapery, painting the room in shades of blood and gold. The sheets are embroidered with symbols of fertility, woven patterns of vines, grapes, pomegranates, reminders of the duty that overshadows every breath you take. The scent of roses lingers, but it is no longer sweet, crushed, heavy, almost. Rancid, it clings to your skin as though it knows what is about to happen. You sit, or rather, you are placed. The silk of your gown pools around you, cold now, suffocating. Somewhere beneath the noise of your pulse, you hear the muffled laughter of guests still feasting in distant halls. Their merriment feeds upon your silence. This night is not yours. It never was, you realize then, in the flicker of candlelight, that every story of queens and glory was a mask for this moment. The night when innocence is traded for power, when your body becomes a battlefield disguised as a bed. And though you have not yet been touched, fear has already claimed you, wrapping itself tighter than any veil. For you understand with chilling clarity that the terror is not in what begins tonight, but in knowing it will never truly end. The wedding night was never a private ritual of intimacy. It was a public duty staged in secrecy. Behind the heavy oak door, the chamber became less a place of rest and more a stage upon which an entire kingdom's future was to be proven. The bed, tall and draped in crimson velvet, loomed like an altar. Every fold of the sheets whispered expectation. Every candle flame leaned inward as if watching. Sometimes attendants waited just beyond the door, ready to inspect the linens come morning for evidence of consummation. Proof that the bride had surrendered her body and the union had been sealed with blood. You were not alone, even in this silence. You were never alone again. The man who entered was not always a stranger, yet he might as well have been. A king, a prince, a noble groom. He carried with him the weight of lineage, of alliances, of war averted or provoked by your compliance. His hands were not guided by tenderness, but by necessity. In his eyes, you were not a bride, but a vessel, a chalice that must pour forth heirs. His touch was claimed by law, sanctified, by religion, justified by power. To refuse was unthinkable. To resist was treasonous. Your body had become both battlefield and treaty. Your silence the ink upon which dynasties were written. The chamber air was suffocating, thick with the mingled scents of wax, sweat, and wine. The fire hissed in the hearth, sparks flaring and dying like the fleeting breaths of freedom you still clung to. Outside, the castle walls held steady against the night, indifferent to your fear. And as the weight of expectation pressed down upon you, you realized There were no chains of iron to bind you, no shackles upon your wrists. The true prison was unseen. It was stitched into your gown, whispered into your prayers, written into laws older than your name. The chamber did not need locks. It had something stronger: duty. The first touch was not always cruel, but it was always foreign. A hand upon your wrist, the brush of fabric pulled away, the sharp tug of laces loosed. Yet even in its gentlest form, it was a violation, not of flesh alone, but of choice. The chamber smelled of wax and smoke, the fire snapping as though mocking the silence you were forced to keep. Your heart thundered so violently you thought it might betray you, but no sound escaped your lips. To speak would have been to risk shame, to risk punishment, to risk becoming a story whispered in corridors of defiance crushed. And so you endured, as countless queens had endured before. The act itself was less a union than a ritual, heavy with symbolism yet stripped of tenderness. The priests called it holy, the nobles called it necessary. But to you it was terror disguised as sanctity. For every movement was watched, if not by eyes in the chamber, then by the invisible gaze of a court waiting for proof. The consummation was never yours. It belonged to the kingdom, to the treaties inked by men who would never set foot in this room. You were not a woman in that bed. You were an empire's currency. Pain was expected, almost celebrated. Blood upon the sheets was proof of purity. The visible sacrifice demanded of you. Some brides wept quietly into pillows. Others clenched their fists until nails drew crescents of blood in their palms. All of them were silent. Silence was the armor passed from queen to queen, the only defense in a world where words could not save you. When it ended, there was no comfort, no tenderness, only the heavy certainty that this night was not the end of fear, but the beginning of its reign. And as the candles guttered low, you understood why so many queens aged in shadows. Because from this night forward, their crowns were forged not in gold, but in silence and scars. Morning came not as relief, but as judgment. The chamber that had felt suffocating in candlelight was now harshly revealed by pale daylight, its silks and velvet no longer romantic but oppressive. Servants entered, discreet yet deliberate, their eyes lowered but their purpose clear. They gathered the sheets with the solemnity of priests collecting relics, searching for proof of blood, proof of purity, proof that the kingdom's bargain had been sealed. If the stains were there, you were declared virtuous, your terror transformed into triumph for others. If they were not, whispers began, whispers that could ruin not just you, but the fragile ties between kingdoms. The weight of an empire had rested on your body, and your silence had carried it through the night. Religion made the silence holy. Priests preached that obedience was sacred, that a wife's submission mirrored the church's submission to God. To speak of pain was to invite sin. To resist was to invite damnation. You were told that your suffering was a gift, that through it you became sanctified, that in the breaking of your body, the will of heaven was fulfilled. And so the screams that wanted to tear from your throat were swallowed, buried beneath hymns and prayers recited in cold stone chapels. The court made silence survival. A queen who whispered of cruelty could be cast as hysterical, a danger to the dynasty, a liability. A queen who endured was praised for her dignity, her composure, her strength, and so the lesson was carved into your bones. Suffering must be hidden, dignity preserved at all costs. Every smile at court, every gentle nod to ambassadors, became a mask stretched across the face of someone who had learned that silence was not weakness, but armor. And within that silence, queens disappeared. They became shadows draped in jewels, bodies that walked the halls but no longer belonged to themselves. The Chamber of Chains did not end with the closing of its doors. It followed them into every corridor, every chapel, every council room. For once a queen learned to be silent, she was never truly heard again. The morning after the wedding night was not the end of dread, but the start of its echo. For while the court celebrated a union fulfilled, you awoke to the realization that your body was no longer your own. The crown, placed upon your head in Ceremony was not a crown of gold but of thorns, pressing deeper with every breath. Your duty was no longer symbolic, it was flesh and blood. You were expected to conceive quickly, to carry the fragile hope of dynasties within your womb. Failure meant disgrace, miscarriage meant whispers of curses, of weakness, of God's displeasure, and so every glance upon your stomach became a judgment, every passing month without child, a silent accusation. The rituals of marriage did not fade into tenderness. They became routine, demanded again and again, as though repetition could summon an heir through sheer persistence. Some nights you endured in silence, staring at the ceiling where shadows played across carved beams, wondering if queens before you had counted the same cracks in the wood, the same sparks in the fire. Other nights, fear and exhaustion twisted into prayer, whispered to saints who had no power over men or over the laws of lineage. In the court, you smiled. You were painted in portraits draped in ermine and jewels, your face softened by the brushstrokes of men who would never know the bruises hidden beneath your sleeves. You were paraded in processions, applauded as the embodiment of virtue, the very symbol of the kingdom's prosperity. But behind each cheer lay expectation. Produce heirs, secure the dynasty, bear the weight without complaint. Your body had become a battlefield fought not in open war, but in silence, where victory was measured in children born and failure was punished with shame. And as you learned to move through the palace halls with grace, you felt the invisible crown of thorns tighten, a constant reminder that queenship was not glory, but sacrifice carved into flesh. Each day unfolded like a performance, and you, the queen, were its unwilling actress. The court expected radiance, composure, a flawless mask that concealed the fractures beneath. Your mornings began with attendants dressing you in gowns heavy, enough to weigh down your spine, lacing you into fabrics embroidered with pearls and threaded with gold. Yet no matter how exquisite the garments, they could not hide the exhaustion in your eyes or the ache in your body from endless demands. Mirrors reflected an image of grace, but you no longer recognized the woman staring back. She was painted in perfection, yet hollowed by silence. Humiliation crept into the smallest corners of life. Physicians and midwives, men and women alike, whispered over your body as though you were a specimen. Your fertility, their chief concern, each missed cycle, each miscarriage, became a matter of state. Your grief was not private. It was recorded, discussed, and debated by courtiers whose own children played freely in the gardens, while you mourned in secret. If you cried, you were told to be strong. If you refused, you were told to be obedient. Every reaction was judged, every emotion weaponized against you. Worse still were the betrayals you were forced to endure in silence. Kings strayed openly, filling their chambers with mistresses whose laughter rang like mockery through palace walls. You were expected to smile, to extend civility to women who usurped not your throne, but your very place in your husband's bed. To protest was to risk scandal. To rage was to be branded hysterical. And so you sat through dinners where their perfume lingered, through ceremonies where their jewels caught the same candlelight that should have belonged to your crown. In time, the silence hollowed you. It pressed against your ribs, settling into your bones until you no longer knew where duty ended and where you began. The court called you serene, dignified, composed. But you knew the truth. What they praised as strength was only survival. A mask, so tightly bound that even you could not always remember the face beneath it. Yet even within silence, rebellion found its cracks. Queens were never granted freedom, but some learned to carve it in secret, in whispers and gestures so small they were invisible to those who thought them powerless. A letter smuggled beneath, layers of cloth, written in a hand careful not to betray emotion, might reach a trusted ally across borders. A glance held too long at court, a secret understanding with an ambassador, could plant seeds of influence beyond the king's notice. Some queens used their patronage of scholars or artists as veils, commissioning works that carried hidden messages, symbolic defiance painted into tapestries, or inked into verses only the keen would recognize. There were other rebellions too, quieter and more dangerous. Refusals cloaked in illness, feigned weakness to avoid a knight's demand, the slow gathering of allies among ladies-in-waiting, loyal confidants who carried not only gowns and jewels but secrets, even the act of survival itself, enduring in the face of suffocation, became its own rebellion, a refusal to let the system consume every part of the soul. And in the rarest moments, queens dared to speak, not to the court, but to their daughters. In hushed tones behind closed doors, they passed on truths forbidden in public. That crowns cut deeper than they glittered. That silence was a chain, but also a shield. That endurance was not weakness, but a weapon. Still, these rebellions carried a cost. Each secret move, each act of defiance, was a risk that could unravel everything. A discovered letter might lead to confinement. A whispered complaint could be twisted into treason. Even love, should a queen dare to seek comfort in another, was perilous, punishable by exile or death. And yet, despite the danger, rebellion flickered like a candle hidden in a darkened room. It did not burn away the chains, but it reminded queens that they were not only vessels, not only symbols, not only shadows. Beneath the crown of thorns, beneath the silence and scars, there remained a heartbeat that refused to surrender entirely. History remembers crowns, wars, treaties, and heirs, but it rarely remembers the tremors in the bridal chambers, where queens endured their most private battles. Chroniclers, almost always men, wrote of alliances forged and kingdoms united. Yet they glossed over the terror that followed a bride into her wedding bed. For them, her body was not a story but a transaction, a vessel whose worth ended with the production of an heir. And so the legacy of silence began, not out of mercy, but out of erasure. The cries muffled behind locked doors were not deemed worthy of parchment, the bruises hidden beneath brocade dismissed as accidents of ritual. Queens who wept were branded weak, those who resisted painted as sinful, those who obeyed praised as dutiful saints of dynastic ambition. What did not fit the narrative of glory was simply struck from the record, yet silence was not absence. It was a strategy. Many queens learned to mask their pain behind the language of obedience, to endure in ways that left little trace for historians. To seize upon, some wrote in diaries meant never to be read, words of confession tucked away in libraries where dust swallowed their truths. Others left their legacy through patronage, commissioning works that celebrated piety, devotion, or motherhood, idealized, images that concealed the fractures beneath. A queen's painted likeness in a cathedral window might show serenity, but it told nothing of the nights that carved her into submission. Even centuries later, the silence persists. When we walk through palaces and gaze upon portraits, we see the polished surface but not the hidden scars. The grandeur of tapestries, the golden halls, the jeweled crowns, they whisper only of triumph, never of terror. But if one listens closely, beyond the chronicles and the official histories, there lingers a shadowed truth. The legacy of queens is not only in their crowns and their heirs, but in the unspoken strength it took to survive nights that history chose to forget. And that silence, heavy and enduring, remains their most haunting. Inheritance. Silence, once rooted, grew into inheritance. For every queen who endured the terror of her first night, there was a daughter watching, learning in fragments the cost of becoming a bride. Rarely did mothers speak openly. Walls had ears, servants carried whispers, and men controlled the narrative. But in glances, in tightened grips of the hand, in warnings disguised as prayers, the truth was passed down. A mother might tell her daughter to walk with grace, to obey her husband, to serve God faithfully, but beneath those words, in the way her voice broke or her eyes refused to meet her child's, another lesson was given. That marriage was not salvation, but a gilded prison. Generations of princesses walked into their betrothals with that dual inheritance, public joy and private dread. They smiled at feasts, their gowns sparkling with embroidery meant to signal their worth. Yet inside, they carried the weight of stories never told aloud, Some rebelled against it, refusing suitors, stalling marriages until they could no longer resist dynastic pressure. Others tried to armor themselves with faith, with resignation, convincing themselves that duty was holy, that obedience would be rewarded in heaven, if not in life. And still, others hardened, their silence turning not into tears, but into masks of stone. This legacy of silence shaped courts across Europe. It turned royal households into places where fear lived beside ceremony, where behind the music of banquets and the glitter of jewels, women taught each other survival. A daughter might never hear her mother say the words, "You will be afraid," but she would notice the way her mother flinched at a touch, or how she prayed longer on the eve of an anniversary. The silences themselves became the loudest teachers, and so the terror endured, not as a single story, but as a lineage of hidden scars, passed like heirlooms from queen to princess, from bride to bride. Their voices, stifled in life, found strange ways to echo, not in the chronicles of kings, but in the quiet shadows where women understood one another without words. But silence, however deep, was never unbreakable. In the cracks of history, faint voices began to emerge. Some queens, trapped by duty yet unwilling to vanish into obedience, left behind traces, letters, confessions, prayers carved in the margins of books. A few dared to cloak their pain in poetry, hiding the truth of their wedding nights behind metaphors of storms, broken glass, or chained birds. These fragments, often dismissed by male chroniclers as fanciful or hysterical, were in truth testimonies of resistance. They revealed women who were not simply passive victims, but quiet witnesses to their own suffering, determined to leave whispers for the future. In certain courts, especially as Europe edged closer to the Enlightenment, women began to share more openly among themselves. Behind closed doors, queens and ladies-in-waiting built fragile sisterhoods, offering words of comfort or even strategies of defiance. Some advised one another to feign illness, to delay consummation, to turn prayer into an armor against the brutality of expectation. Others took more daring steps, securing allies among physicians, confessors, or even servants who could shield them, however briefly, from a husband's demands. It was not freedom, but it was survival carved out of silence. And yet, the silence never fully disappeared. For every queen who left behind a hint of her truth, dozens more remained voiceless, their pain buried under the pomp of coronations and the cold ink of marriage treaties. Their wedding nights were remembered not as traumas, but as political triumphs. For kings, their cries muted by the roar of cannon fire, celebrating dynastic unions. But the seeds had been planted. The very act of leaving behind a word, a symbol, a rumor was itself a fracture, a reminder that silence could never entirely erase experience. In those fragile breaks, history began to glimpse what the chronicles had long ignored, that beneath the splendor of monarchy, queens lived in dread, not of their enemies, but of the beds they were forced to enter. Their silence was never truly consent. It was survival, wrapped in ritual, waiting for a future where the truth might finally be heard. The candle flickers, the silk sheets rustle, the heavy doors of the bridal chamber close, and with them, centuries of silence are sealed again. This was the terror that queens inherited, not the battlefield, not the dagger in the dark, but the bed they were forced to enter. Their crowns shone brightly in portraits, their gowns dazzled in processions, but none of it could shield them from the night that defined their worth in the eyes of men. They smiled in public, yet in the shadows, they carried scars invisible to history. But silence is never complete. Across generations, fragments of truth slipped through, letters, prayers, whispers between mothers and daughters. They did not shatter the system, but they planted seeds, fragile cracks in the walls of obedience. And those cracks matter, because they remind us that even in the most gilded prisons, women sought ways to endure, to leave behind traces of their humanity. The silence may have been survival, but the survival itself was a form of resistance. And, as we look back, the question is no longer only about the past, but about ourselves. How many silences do we still inherit today? How many rituals, systems, and traditions still dress themselves in beauty, while hiding the cost borne by women's bodies. History teaches us that silence can protect, but it can also suffocate. Breaking it, even in fragments, changes everything. So, the next time you see a portrait of a queen, her face serene, her crown heavy with jewels, remember the unseen story. That her most terrifying night was not on a battlefield, but on the very night that was meant to celebrate her union. And remember, too, that history is not only written by kings, it lingers in whispers, in shadows, in the truths women dared to leave behind.